Get ready to hear some timeless historical radio broadcasts. Thank you for visiting Golden Age Radio. Listen to the complete NBC and CBS D-Day broadcasts on rebel.com/C/GAR. Support our veterans by visiting veteransradioministry.com. Let's honor their sacrifice. Thank you.
Our own communiques have reported only light casualties, and we mustn't put too much stock in these German claims of wiping out whole regiments. That's the usual Nazi trick. Here's another bulletin. It says that the Nazi-operated Paris radio today said that it has become clear that General Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of the Allied armies, is concentrating his efforts on the capture of Cherbourg. Cherbourg, as you know, is one of the principal French ports on the English Channel. And now that is the latest word just over the wire on this mammoth military operation. Bulletin by bulletin, report by report, the big story is being built up. For many months, we've been perfecting our plans here at NBC for covering this biggest of all war stories. NBC reporters at this moment are gathering last-minute details at the official news sources of Allied headquarters in Washington, all over the world, in fact. We have been putting these bulletins onto the air just as fast as they've come in, and we will continue to do so. Now, right now, I'm looking at a clock in front of me with a second hand, and right now it is exactly 9:32:09. It is exactly 6 hours since we received at 3:32:09 a bulletin from London. I want to read that bulletin to you again. That was called Communique Number 1 of Allied Supreme Expeditionary Force Headquarters, the first bulletin of the greatest invasion in the history of the world, and this is the way it read. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. That is a communique which will echo down through the corridors of time. That is communique number 1 announcing the Allied invasion of Western Europe, of Hitler's fortified continent. Now, for those 6 hours since that bulletin came out, NBC has been giving you, without interruption, news, bulletins, interviews, eyewitness accounts, every conceivable kind of coverage of this, as we newsmen believe it to be, the greatest news story in the history of warfare. For 6 hours, we have been going on here without interruption. Some of us have made 20 and 30 broadcasts to you already. We're going to continue to give you that coverage without any interruption, without any commercial announcements, without anything but perhaps a little music later in the day occasionally, but nothing but news. We feel this is what you want because millions of American boys are over there taking part in this operation. Your neighbor's boy, maybe your own boy, your husband, is over there. And so we know how vitally interested all of America is, and the National Broadcasting Company is determined to give you every word of news that we can get from that front. And we have a dozen or more men stationed in London. Some of them are flying over France right now in planes. Others are on British ships and American ships. Others are in landing craft. They are covering every possible phase of this invasion for you, and over the radio to which you are now listening, you will receive news broadcast over this microphone into which I am now talking, constantly and continuously all day long today, and without interruption of any kind. And now, for a little musical interlude, we take you to the NBC Orchestra.
On this, the morning of D-Day, the National Broadcasting Company presents a program of martial music attuned to the tempo of the day. is Mr. H.V. Kaltenborn.
A bulletin. Radio Berlin, monitored by NBC, has just admitted that bridgeheads between Le Havre and Boulogne are now firmly in Allied hands. This extends the fighting from Normandy in the direction of the Belgian coast for some distance. It means that we have probably established bridgeheads not only on the Normandy coast, but on the coast of northern France, beyond Le Havre, in the direction of Boulogne. There is a dispatch that German forces launching a counterattack knocked out 35 heavy Allied tanks at Anel in the Seine Bay area. The significance of that is that so many tanks have already been landed that they are pushing to the interior, that a heavy tank battle has already taken place.
We return you now to our program of music. The National Broadcasting Company, continuing its complete coverage of all the invasion news, returns now to the NBC newsroom in New York, where we have Elmer Peterson.
The Germans have now made a significant admission regarding the extent of the Allied attack in France. The Berlin radio, monitored by NBC, today broadcast that the extent of the attack in the areas employed is a large-scale operation, and that the Allied Supreme Command, say the Germans, wants to use the river estuaries of the Seine and Orne rivers to land our heavy armor. That's an indication from the Germans themselves that the invasion is going ahead according to plan and on a very large scale. And here's another bulletin. The German DNB news agency has broadcast today that the 28th and 101st American Parachute Divisions had been dropped in the Normandy Peninsula area of France. The Nazis claim that many have been taken prisoner. Here is the first report in any detail, and it comes, we remind you, from an enemy source regarding these paratroopers and airborne troops which have been dropped behind the German lines in France. One question which now is going to cause a great deal of attention is the part which the French underground, the French patriots, may do to help these paratroopers, these airborne infantrymen. The French people have been warned to get back from the coast, but the plans of the French underground can now be realized. We have yet to get anything like a detailed report from Allied sources on what's happened to our parachute troops, how much resistance they've encountered, to what extent they've been able to consolidate the positions they've already gained. One thing is certain, the Germans will make every effort to encircle these paratroopers and airborne infantrymen, for they are a real threat to German communications. However, these airborne Allied troops are going to have the assistance of the French underground. In fact, some of the most carefully made plans of this invasion are going to be involved in the cooperation, the very close and direct cooperation between the French patriots and the Allied soldiers who are now fighting behind the German lines. For Allied strategy is taking a form which the German commanders fear greatly. Not only must they consider frontal attack, not only must they consider the steady mounting impact of Allied air bombing, they also must consider the fact that their lines may be turned. They must also consider the fact that a threat from the rear can at any time cause them to be encircled. They must consider the fact that as their communications are destroyed, one field commander will have very little idea of what another field commander to his right or his left is engaged in his fundamental strategy. The German Transocean News Agency has another report. It is that about 80 medium-sized Allied warships are approaching the town of Ouistreham in the estuary of the Orne River. Here's another indication of the extent to which our naval forces now are being utilized in this great final attack on the German continent. Another German news agency broadcast said today that Allied landing barges have penetrated into the estuaries of the Orne and Viry rivers in Normandy in the rear of the Atlantic Wall. Meantime, there's bound to be new attention to the great organization involved behind the actual fighting troops. There is more than frontline troops involved here. Streaming across the channel by this time are the engineers, the quartermaster units, the signal corps, all of that intense and widespread organization which is necessary in order to carry the invasion through to its final fulfillment. And a last report, this from the Berlin radio, monitored by NBC. It quotes International Information Service. It says that the Allies plan to land troops in the Balkans, but when they do, they'll be met by twice as many Serbians. International Information Service is believed to be one of the phony press associations set up by the Nazis. However, this report does call attention to the fact that now that the final attack on Europe has started from the west, we must be prepared to see other diversionary operations. Our offensive in Italy is still going forward. Allied troops, Allied navies are waiting in other parts for other attacks, all designed to gradually exert more and more pressure upon the Germans, all designed to more and more force the Germans to use up their strategic reserves. So far, it must be noted that most of the details of the invasion itself are coming from German
and from neutral sources. Our own Allied officials are being cautious. We merely have the bare facts in essence that we have landed on the continent, that we are going ahead. We have been told that things are going according to plan. But that, fundamentally, is all we have as yet. However, the Germans are revealing more and more of their version of the plan, probably because they have no other choice. We also must expect to get a great deal of news now from the neutral capitals.
Thank you, Elmer Peterson. We're standing by in the NBC newsroom, ladies and gentlemen, and as the bulletins come over the wire, we're going to send them out to you immediately. But at 10 o'clock, we're going to have a complete story from our NBC reporters in the newsroom in Washington. Right now, more music. National Broadcasting Company has presented a program of martial music, brought to you by an NBC orchestra playing from our Radio City studios in New York. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
WEAF, New York.
The National Broadcasting Company continues its invasion coverage with a special program from Washington. We present the wives of our invasion leaders, who will be interviewed by Nancy Osgood of the NBC Washington staff. And now, Miss Osgood.
There probably isn't a person in the country today who wouldn't like to broadcast his own personal good luck message to our invasion chiefs and their troops. Well, that, of course, is impossible. So NBC has arranged the next best thing. We have asked the wives of our invasion leaders to do it for us. Mrs. Dwight Eisenhower, Mrs. Harold Stark, Mrs. Carl Spots, Mrs. Allen Kirk, and Mrs. James Doolittle. Their husbands are not only leaders, they're also fighters, men who will share with their troops all of the hardships and dangers of war. Because we know these things, we feel that the wives of these men, the women who know them so well, can speak for all of us in wishing the men their husbands command a quick trip to Berlin. We had hoped to present as our first guest today Mrs. Dwight Eisenhower, wife of the commander of our invasion forces, but she has found it impossible to be with us. This is more than D-Day to the Eisenhowers because today, at the graduation exercises at West Point Academy, their son, John Eisenhower, becomes Second Lieutenant John Eisenhower, United States Army. Mrs. Eisenhower cannot be with us this morning, but she's given a personal message to us to broadcast for her, and these are her words. This period of waiting for the invasion has been a great strain for all of us. We have been waiting and watching for the word which finally reached us officially at 3:32 this morning. We know now that our men are attacking our enemies. We know that they will be victorious. But we also know that they have many trying hours ahead, hours in which we shall find it difficult not to be restless and unnerved. We're eager to help in some big way, and yet if we could ask our fighting men what they would have us do, they would tell us, ours is the job to fight, yours to help, by remaining as cheerful and as busy as possible. So let's have faith, cheerfully wish them luck, and work a little harder than ever before, even if only to roll bandages for an extra hour each week. It will all count, all help to bring our men home sooner. This has been a personal message from Mrs. Dwight Eisenhower, wife of the commander of our invasion forces. And now let's hear from Mrs. Harold Stark. Her husband, Admiral Stark, is in command of all our naval forces in the European theater. And what is your wish for the Admiral and his men today, Mrs. Stark?
My wish is the same as that of everyone else. May the troops have all the luck in the world so that victory will come quicker. But I want to add something more. In fact, I think we all have the same idea in the back of our minds, that it's going to take more than just plain luck.
Yes, indeed, we do need more than an ordinary share of luck, but at least we know that we have the best of everything else, leaders, men, and equipment.
But we need more than that. Our troops are launching the biggest military operation in history. Naturally, their success is our biggest concern, but we aren't helping by just thinking about it. Our own spirits will remain higher, and the war be shortened if each one of us keeps just as busy as possible.
Well, I understand that you yourself are a very good example of keeping busy, Mrs. Stark. But speaking of advice, tell us, have you ever given the Admiral any instructions as to how he should take care of himself?
Yes, indeed, I have sent him plenty of instructions, but carrying out those instructions is another matter. In fact, he has slept through several air raids.
Well, that sounds as if the Admiral isn't afraid of the Luftwaffe. And judging from recent operations, it doesn't look as if any of our high command is. However, the German Air Force is something to be reckoned with in the invasion. Mrs. Spots, who is the wife of Lieutenant General Spots, commanding the strategic air forces in Great Britain, should be able to tell us something about that. Mrs. Spots?
Actually, Miss Osgood, I would rather talk about our own air forces than the Luftwaffe. As an air wife, I am tremendously proud of our air forces, especially the magnificent pre-invasion job they have done. That great softening up job will be responsible for saving the lives of thousands of American soldiers and sailors.
Well, that is true, Mrs. Spots. And that thought, I should think, must be very reassuring to the families of those infantrymen and artillerymen and all the others who are today battling their way into Hitler's Europe.
Yes, it must help to know that air power has made it easier for the others. And it should also be the greatest comfort and pride to the families of Air Force men, especially to those families whose men are missing or have been killed in action. You'll remember Prime Minister Churchill's famous phrase, "Never have so many owed so much to so few." That's as true today as it was in 1940. For the aerial supremacy, which we so surely have, will cut invasion casualties to an absolute minimum.
We may have what will seem like very high casualties these first few days, Mrs. Spots, but we know there'll be nothing like we might have had without air superiority.
That's very true. And you can be sure that we do have that air superiority. For the invasion would not have been launched without it. Never in history has a great military undertaking been so carefully planned. I hope all you wives and mothers understand that. Everything has been thought of and done to give that man of yours the best chance possible of coming through this terrific action. You can be sure of that, and you can take comfort in it.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Spots. As we send our good luck greetings to your husband and his airmen today, we can also add our thanks for making it safer and easier. Now, the Navy, too, has a big job in this invasion. Everything, from our biggest warship to the smallest landing boat, has a specific job to do. The man who is in charge of the United States Naval Invasion Task Forces, Admiral Alan G. Kirk, once summed up the Navy's responsibility very well. Just how did he put it, Mrs. Kirk?
My husband has said that when American soldiers are to be landed on foreign soil, it is the duty and the privilege of the American Navy to put those troops and their equipment ashore, to keep them supplied and to protect the landings as long as may be necessary.
That's it. And that's what Admiral Kirk and his men are really doing right now.
You see, Admiral Kirk and his staff have been in England many months planning and preparing for this very thing. As you know, we've undertaken tremendous amphibious operations before, in Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, and in the Pacific. We've learned valuable lessons from all of these landings, sometimes at great cost. But every one of those lessons is being put to advantage at this moment. Consequently, we can be certain that this, the biggest landing of all, will be the most successful. Here at home, we can believe in success as well as wish for it, and I hope that every one of you will put your confidence in our Navy. Theirs is a splendid and terrible responsibility, but it's one they will surely fulfill.
And we do sincerely know that, and we believe, of course, in success, Mrs. Kirk. For we know your famous husband meant it when he said it was up to his Navy to land our troops on foreign shores and keep them supplied afterwards. Thank you so very much, Mrs. Kirk, for representing the thousands of Navy families all over the country in wishing their sons good luck and successful landings. And we have another mother here in the studio today, Mrs. James Doolittle, who has a double family interest in this invasion. Her husband, General James Doolittle, who led the first aerial invasion of Japan, the famed Tokyo raid, is commanding the 8th Air Force. And Mrs. Doolittle's son, Captain James Doolittle, Jr., is flying with the 9th Air Force. Mrs. Doolittle, this is a very important day for you.
It is indeed, Miss Osgood. But then, it is for everyone. It's the moment for which we've all been waiting. And now that it's come, it's still a long march ahead to ultimate victory. The boys know that we have complete confidence in their success. However, there's even a greater job to be done than has taken place before, not only on the invasion front, but on the home front as well. We'll need teamwork here as well as there.
Well, we certainly all agree with you on that, Mrs. Doolittle.
Our troops expect even more than our confidence. We need more than ever before, to show our courage. They expect us to keep our chins up. We know that this invasion will be costly, but as Mrs. Stark has said, there's nothing like work to take our minds off of that. And two, it makes our men happier. I've talked to so many of them when they've come home from the fronts, and they're much more contented when they know that their women are actually doing something, anything to hurry victory.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Mrs. Doolittle, for I'm sure that all those women who are doing some kind of war work feel a very special contentment and pride today. They know that they helped make this invasion possible.
That's right. And that's why I'd like to say, especially to those mothers who have given so much toward victory, your sons are fighting to make that victory possible. General Doolittle has said to me very often, my boys are tops. They never stop to think what may happen to them. They just do their job.
Thank you, Mrs. Doolittle. I think you've summed it up very well, for that is what thousands of Americans are doing today. Our soldiers, sailors, and airmen are all fighting with all their might to clear the road to Berlin. They aren't thinking of what may happen to them. They're just doing their job. And behind them is a nation not only wishing them luck, but pushing them along that road with everything it has. The wives of our invasion leaders have put it better than anyone else could possibly have done. The men have our prayers, our confidence, and our support.
You have just heard good luck messages to our invasion troops from the wives of their leaders, Mrs. Harold Stark, Mrs. Carl Spotts, Mrs. Ellen Kirk, Mrs. James Doolittle, and a personal message from Mrs. Dwight Eisenhower, who was unable to be here in person, with Nancy Osgood of the NBC Washington staff as commentator.
And now here's a special announcement just handed to me. Tonight, at 10 o'clock Eastern Wartime, the President of the United States will speak over the NBC network.
Here's a bulletin from the NBC newsroom in Washington. London. The DNB agency reported this afternoon that at one point, the Allied troops driving onto the beaches of France have penetrated several miles to the south. Meanwhile, our invasion forces have taken beachheads in French Normandy and are fighting their way inland. A German broadcast claims that Nazi forces are counterattacking at Arnel. Marshal Pétain has asked Frenchmen not to take steps which will bring reprisals. 11,000 Allied aircraft are taking part in the invasion. The Allies, according to the Germans, are using balloons along the Channel as artillery observation posts. And Russians in Moscow are literally dancing with glee over the invasion news. This bulletin came to you from the NBC newsroom in Washington. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
This is Don Goddard in the NBC newsroom in New York. Well, how did your hometown react to the great and solemn news this morning? In the dispatches from every city and hamlet throughout the world of these United Nations comes the same story. They're piled up here on our news desk today. A story of relief and joy, tempered by the knowledge that these are tense hours when hundreds and thousands of American lives hang in the balance for humanity. Yes, people seem to say the waiting is over. And Americans looked at each other this morning and said, this is it. In many a quiet hamlet, the church bells pealed to announce the news and also to summon America to her knees in prayer. There was an impulse, I think, that we all had in common, Christian and Jews and every kind of sect, and even men and women who might have forgotten how to pray, knelt once more with their eyes toward God. In Rome, the holy city, our Ralph Howard described a great celebration when the news broke, the second celebration since Rome was freed from the Nazi yoke. And here are the other places. Take them at random, everywhere you look. In Sydney, Australia, crowds swarm from business buildings into the streets today with the news of an Allied landing in France. Men in uniform were grabbed up and carried shoulder high through the streets. Traffic was blocked. And in Helena, Montana, troops who train army sled and pack dogs at Camp Rimini set in the rugged mountains 9 miles west of Helena and came out of their beds when the invasion news broke. And they called the Associated Press Bureau out there continuously. We'll stay up and see, they said. And they stayed up and saw. And in San Francisco, this June 6th will go down at least twice as momentous a day in World War II in 1942 and 1944. Exactly 2 years ago, you remember, it marked the finale of the Battle of Midway, now recognized as Japan's greatest thrust at the Western Hemisphere. And out in Columbus, Ohio, special church services were held throughout Columbus, and Governor John W. Brecker said the invasion marked the beginning of the end of the forces of evil and destruction. And in Stockholm, the news caused comparatively little excitement there today in Stockholm. And here's a bulletin just in from London. The stock exchange opened steady today, but on the bond market, continental bonds, particularly French and Polish issues, gained sharply. And here in New York, the New York Racing Associations have announced that racing today, the program at Aqueduct, will be canceled. This is Don Goddard in the NBC newsroom in New York.
We pause now for station identification. WEAF, New York.
An analysis of the latest reports from the invasion front brought to you by the Dean of American Commentators, NBC's H.B. Kaltenborn.
The most encouraging fact about this invasion from the Allied point of view is that we had 4,000 ships and 11,000 planes with which to cover it. That means two great things: control of the sea and control of the air. And through control of the sea and control of the air, the powers that have gathered in the British Isles, the mighty invasion force that has now begun to land, through that control, they will be able to establish control of the land. Everything that has happened so far indicates that that control has already begun, has moved more rapidly than even those of us who were most sanguine have dared to hope. For we all had in mind the experience of Dieppe. We had in mind some of the difficulties that we had experienced in Africa, in Sicily, in Italy. And yet, here in France, so far as we now know, many of those difficulties were either eliminated or overcome. For it is certain, on the basis of German admissions, that we have penetrated the estuaries of two important rivers in Normandy, that we have landed tanks in large numbers behind the so-called Hitler Atlantic Wall, that our paratroopers landed successfully at key points in Normandy and elsewhere, and that, so far, the invasion, as Mr. Churchill told Commons this morning, is going according to plan, and what a plan. In other words, we've made a magnificent start. Obviously, the Germans are only now beginning to recover from their first surprise, for it evidently was a surprise. They had obviously counted on our taking advantage of that short 20-mile distance between Dover and Calais. They had not counted that we would risk the 80-mile crossing from southern England over to Normandy, and they were evidently not as well prepared there as they were presumably prepared across the Channel. Certainly, that helped us in our opening moves. All the German admissions are significant, for obviously they would not make them unless they felt they had to. We penetrated into the estuaries of the Seine and the Orne rivers. The Seine, tremendously important, because once we control that estuary, we are in a position to fight for the possession of the tremendously important port of Le Havre, which the French only in recent years developed to the point where it is their most important transatlantic port, with every possible equipment for the landing of every type of ship. And the control of the estuary of the Orne River means control of the important town of Caen, a great railroad center in Normandy, and undoubtedly also a center of airfields, which in the flat country surrounding that particular area could readily be established in considerable numbers. And of course, it is our purpose in landing on this particular part of Normandy to secure for our use some of those airfields. And while we have no precise indication that our paratroopers who have landed in large numbers are landing there for the purpose of seizing airfields, we know that that undoubtedly is the plan which they would follow. For once we control the airfield, our control of the air can then be transferred from the coast of Britain to the coast and to the inland points of France. And if we begin with airfields in that flat country in the neighborhood of Caen, get control of those, then we are in a position from there to move steadily forward from one airfield to another in cooperation with our landing forces at various points on the French coast. And according to the reports that have come to us, our landings are not confined to Normandy. They extend much farther to the north and to the east along the Channel coast. They go as far as Boulogne, and some have been made even east and north of Boulogne, which means that we are alerting the Germans at a dozen different places along something like 250 miles of coast, so that already their railroad problem is a difficult one, because they are unable to concentrate their forces at any given point. They must be prepared to meet what might be a major thrust anywhere along 250 miles of coast, and it is a 250 miles of coast where for the past 2 years we have been bombing the railroads, bombing every possible type of construction that could aid those who would resist invasion. We have landed heavy armor. That, too, comes from the Germans. They tell us of one tank battle in which they claim to have knocked out 35 tanks. Well, perhaps they did knock out a score or even more of tanks, but how many more were left? For obviously, if we have penetrated the estuaries of those rivers, if, thanks to this huge invasion fleet of 4,000 ships and other smaller ships, we have managed to get up into those rivers with these landing barges, which again and again at various fronts I have seen discharging their tanks by rolling right up on the shore, why, it's quite possible that we have landed hundreds of tanks at several points. And once we have succeeded in doing that, then we are in a position to carry on, to move over the excellent French roads, to follow up with armor, with mechanized material, so that we can move with speed, move with precision, move with firepower. And here, that vast accumulation of military material which we have been building in the United States, which we have transferred to the British Isles, and which today has begun to land in France, will stand us in good stead. A bulletin from an Allied air base in England tells us that many Allied assault troops are now already beyond the initial danger zone of total exposure in France. That means that they have established themselves, that possibly they have made connection with the landings on the coast, that they are no longer isolated units defending themselves alone against superior forces of Germans, but that already contact has been established between those forces that were landed 10, 15 miles, 20 miles inland, and those that are landing barges inland, and those that are landing barges deposited on the shore where they established their beach positions. The Germans tell us that we have definitely established ourselves in at least 2 places firmly, so that we have been able to not only to hold the beachheads, but to penetrate beyond them, to force our way inland, which of course is the test of any successful invasion. Within the last few hours, British heavy bombers dropped 5,000 tons of bombs on the Channel coast batteries. That happened last night and early today. That's a new record of bombing. That climaxes 2 years of bombing. That reminds us how magnificently our great air power has paved the way successfully for today's events. The Germans tell us that landings have been made on 2 Channel Islands of Jersey and Guernsey. Those Channel Islands are some 80-odd miles from the coast of England, but they're only a few miles from the coast of Normandy. And from those islands, once we have established air bases on them, and that will not take long, we can strike either towards Brittany or towards Normandy. We will have comparatively secure air bases again because of our control of the sea, from which we can strike in to the help of any particular detachment that may be in difficulties somewhere in the interior of Normandy. And the seizure of those islands is an important factor in the development of our offensive. A cross-channel bombardment began this morning from the area of Calais in the direction of Dover. You have heard of those tremendous long-range German guns that have been firing at intervals. They fired this morning for only 45 minutes, and then the Air Force that started from the British Isles and that went over the position of the guns and that soon located them, by dropping their loads of bombs, promptly silenced them. Here, as elsewhere, what we had thought of as secret German devices, as particular German ingenious mechanisms to prevent invasion, failed to come off. No secret weapon on the part of the Germans has so far been developed, at least none that we've had any inkling of. And we were surprised at the comparative lack of underwater obstructions when our barges approached the invasion coast. We managed to reach the coast with comparative ease and, so far as we are aware, with comparatively little loss. Our own secret weapon, the little one-man submarine, helped us tremendously because those little craft went across the channel last night and established markers so that every invasion barge, as it approached the French coast this morning, knew exactly where it was intended to land. The weather was with us. The moon was out. Conditions, so far as we know, were particularly favorable for our landing operations. The first German defenses, then, established along the coast, have evidently failed. The shore batteries, on which they counted so much, failed to stop our invasion barges. Why? Because those barges were covered by fighter planes to such an extent that those batteries, as soon as they opened up and revealed their positions, were promptly knocked out. That is, those that have not already been knocked out by that particularly heavy bombardment which has been concentrated on that channel coast now for several weeks past. Our experiences in Africa and Sicily and Italy have proved invaluable in organizing today's invasion. Many bitter lessons had to be learned. Fortunately, we have learned them. We have found ways to overcome the difficulties that developed during those early invasions when we were inexperienced and when our mechanized invasion material was not as good as it is today. You may have wondered why it took us so long to develop this invasion. The reason is the determination on the part of the Allied command to make it as inexpensive as possible in human life. A bulletin has just come from Washington that tells us that President Roosevelt has called the High Command to the White House for a D-Day conference. He called into consultation the highest-ranking military and naval officials. That means Admiral King, General Marshall, General Arnold, among others. He will confer with them, and perhaps on the basis of what they tell him, he will give the nation some message, perhaps at his regular press conference today. This is not the only invasion. Remember that this is but a beginning. Yes, the Germans say we landed 3 paratroop divisions, but we have more than 3 paratroop divisions. We have only made a beginning. The great mass of the accumulated human and mechanized material that we have been piling up in the British Isles for the past year, all that has not yet begun to be landed. We have huge forces that are available for a landing in southern France, something that the King of Norway said this morning in speaking to his people suggested to me the possibility of an invasion of Norway. And so, on this great day, let us recognize that invasion has begun, but only one invasion, not the only one. Thanks to our patience, thanks to the long delay, thanks to the determination to save human life, we can now make invasion after invasion until they bring victory. Good morning.
You have just heard an analysis of the latest reports from the invasion front brought to you by the Dean of American Commentators, NBC's H.V. Kaltenborn. The National Broadcasting Company will continue to bring you complete and full reports on the invasion as they come to us at the NBC newsroom here in New York. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
11:15 a.m. Eastern Wartime, WEAF, New York. The National Broadcasting Company brings you a program of songs by Tommy Taylor.
It had to be you. It had to be you. I wandered around, finally found somebody who could make me be true, could make me be blue, even be glad just to be sad thinking of you. Some others I've seen might never be me, might never be.
This is the National Broadcasting Company in New York. Ladies and gentlemen, we will bring you bulletins just as soon as they are made available. In the meantime, we invite you to listen to music by the NBC Orchestra. We suggest you stay tuned for later developments.
For nobody else gave me a thrill. With all your faults, I love you still. It had to be you, wonderful you, had to be you.
This is the NBC Newsroom in New York, and here is Mr. H.V. Kaltenborn.
A bulletin from London. Military observers said today that a general Russian offensive, coordinated with the Anglo-American attack from the west, may be launched within the next 48 hours and almost certainly will begin before the weekend. That is exactly what the Germans have been expecting. That is why they launched their counteroffensive north of Jassy in Romania. That is why they have concentrated every possible military effort of which they were capable into developing that offensive into a major attack. In that attempt, they have failed. The Russians have now had some 4 weeks in which to marshal their forces, develop their transportation, prepare their troops for the next great effort on the Eastern Front. And in accordance with the decisions reached by the Allied chiefs of state at their meetings in Moscow and Tehran, that offensive was sure to be coordinated with the launching of our offensive in Western Europe. And so, before the week is out, the nutcracker driving against Hitler's forces from east and west will be in effect.
Thank you, Mr. Kaltenborn. We now return you to our regularly scheduled program by Tommy Taylor.
If they asked me, I could write a book about the way you walk and whisper and look. I could write a preface on how we met, so the world would never forget. And the simple secret of the plot is just to tell them that I love you a lot. Then the world discovers how my book ends, how to make two lovers of friends. I could write a preface on how we met, so the world would never forget. And the simple secret of the plot is just to tell them that I love you a lot. When the world discovers, as my book ends, how was a wish me happy falling. No more being lonely. Can I be lonely? You look at me and suddenly it's spring. High on a hilltop, love is calling. Someone should wish me happy falling. No more being lonely. Can I be lonely? You look at me and suddenly it's
This is the NBC Newsroom in New York. And here again is NBC's Elmer Peterson.
In a special invasion extra, the Army newspaper Stars and Stripes at Naples reported today that 30,000 Allied paratroopers have landed in France to spearhead the massive operations now underway along the Normandy coast and inland from the Normandy coast. It's a good indication of how extensive this attack on France is. On the other hand, as we have indicated before, there's good reason to believe that this will by no means be the only point of attack. In fact, we are waiting momentarily now for announcement of new invasion thrusts on the continent. The Germans are afraid of this. The Berlin radio expresses fear that subsequent landings, later today perhaps, from point of weight, will make the initial landings minute by comparison. Up to this moment, Allied headquarters, and for tactical reasons, has been silent concerning the location of the assault, except for disclosing that Normandy was the general area. The Allied seaborne troops were led by the British commander, General Montgomery, and the men surged across the channel by 4,000 regular ships and by additional thousands of smaller craft. 11,000 planes supported the attack, and the latest report is that they have dropped no less than 5,000 tons of bombs against the German fortifications along the coast. Reports direct from the beachhead, although meager, make one specific pronouncement, namely that the invasion so far can be termed a success, that the Allied command has made good in its greatest gamble of the war so far. And it was nothing less than a gamble, for the landings were made against the strongest fortified section of the French coast. They were made against defenses on which the Nazis have worked with their best engineers for several years. They were made against everything the Germans could put up in the way of defense. Allied reconnaissance pilots now report encouragingly that the invasion troops have secured the beachheads and are cutting steadily inland. And if any confirmation is needed, Vichy radio admits the drive inland is going right ahead. An Allied reconnaissance flyer says that our forces have pushed beyond the coastal danger area. It calls attention to what may be our far-reaching strategy. It may be that we intend to cut straight across southwestward through France in a wide encircling movement which will be joined by attacks in southern France. And a late broadcast by the Berlin radio says that Allied tanks have penetrated several miles now between the towns of Caen and Isigny on the Norman Peninsula. NBC's reporter Ed Hocker flew over 20 miles of the invasion coast this morning, and he reports that not a single German coastal gun was firing in the entire invasion zone, which would indicate that our forces have completely knocked out the enemy's initial line of defenses. It may be that the Atlantic Wall will not in the end prove as formidable as had been feared. It must be remembered, however, that the Germans' own strategy undoubtedly will be to withdraw and then bring powerful counterattacks to bear. And to our powerful Navy guns go credit for smashing the Germans' first line of defense. More than 640 guns, as we've reported before, hurled thousands of shells into the German fortifications, many of them 16-inch shells. Explosive tore through those fortifications on which the Germans rested their hopes of blocking the first landings on the continent. 2 American parachute divisions, the 28th and the 101st, have been dropped behind German lines and presumably are attending to the business of ripping up enemy communication lines, seizing airfields, and strategic rail lines. And one development, of course, as the invasion progresses, will be that we will make use of captured airfields. The Germans will have left these airfields cut up, destroyed as best they could do it. But our engineers will go to work, as they have done in Italy, to repair airfields quickly, and thus give us advanced air bases for further attacks against the Germans. President Roosevelt will go on the air at 10 o'clock tonight and lead the nation in a prayer for victory. After his talk last night on the fall of Rome, he retired to his room to start writing the prayer. Mr. Roosevelt expresses hope that the entire nation will join with him in voicing the prayer at 10 o'clock tonight, Eastern War time. As we've said before, the attack along the Normandy coast of France, this invasion, calls attention to the part which Russia may soon play in bringing to bear against the German a great encircling movement from all sides. In fact, in Russia, they've received the news with great joy. The Russian people are elated. Their 3 years of waiting for the blow from the West has now become a reality. And the attack has a special significance for the armies of Premier Joseph Stalin. For there are new reports coming in by the hour now, which indicate that the Russians, who have been preparing for a long time for new offensives, soon may take this attack on France as a signal for contributing a further share towards the eventual defeat of the Nazis. The Russian troops are ready to perform their part in this final offensive to crush all that Nazism stands for. In fact, in London at this moment, there are predictions that a new Russian offensive may be launched at any moment. Berlin would have us believe that the German people are taking the invasion calmly, with no excitement, no extraditions, no special radio announcements. An early morning broadcast from Berlin tried to minimize the magnitude of the cross-channel thrust. It said that the Allied intentions are not clear. But in a subsequent announcement, the Berlin radio was forced to change its tune to this, that the Allied landings mean this is the great invasion. And what the effect will be on the German people, we can only imagine. They have had their hopes of a split between Russia and Britain and America. They have had their hopes, carefully built up by Nazi propagandists, that somehow the Atlantic Wall would hold back the invasion of France. These hopes are now being dissipated. Gradually, it will dawn upon the German people more and more that an overwhelming power is being put against them, and that eventually they must face final and inevitable defeat. All of Europe, all of the conquered peoples, knew at the very inception that the invasion had started. They were told by radio. They were told by their own underground means of communications. Huge Allied cargo planes barraged the continent with tons and tons of paper. Messages written in every language saying that this is the hour to strike. This is the hour that marks the beginning of liberation for you people of the occupied countries. And so all of those fine preparations over a period of months and years in the occupied countries now will find their realization. In fact, the underground patriots in France at this moment, no doubt, are proving a great assistance to Allied troops, especially those parachute troops, those airborne infantrymen, who, fighting behind the German lines, need every help they can get, and who, if they can hold on, if they can gain advantage and hold it, will provide a real breach in German defenses. For the time will come when our forces working inland will join up with those parachute troops, and we then will have achieved the first real break in German communications in the German defenses. As a matter of fact, the people of Europe were the first to know that D-Day had arrived. So intense was the barrage of paper bullets which began falling upon them even before the real bullets began falling on the enemy. A late claim by Berlin that the Nazis have launched a counterattack at Eisenhower near the mouth of the Seine River and knocked out 35 Allied tanks has no confirmation as yet from Allied headquarters. And the enemy asserts further that his counter-thrusts east of Cherbourg also are making headway. But the supreme German counterattack is not expected possibly for a week, by which time they will have been able to bring up all their reserve strength for perhaps an area 500 miles around. However, this lays the enemy open to attacks from other points, new amphibious landings, and we shall strike wherever they weaken themselves most. In fact, the German High Command, as we've said before, now faces a moment of great decision. If they withdraw their troops from one point, they weaken themselves and expose themselves to new attacks. They must keep their troops in readiness all along the Atlantic Wall, while we, in turn, exert heavy pressure at one and more points. And here's a report just come in. General Charles de Gaulle, leader of the French Provisional Government, has just arrived in London. And one of his first acts was to make an address to the people of France. His speech in French now is being sent by beam from London. We will bring you the general words to his people as soon as they are available here. Certainly it calls new attention to the great moment which has arrived for the French people. This moment when, finally, after years, they see Allied armies again striking back on French soil, this time far more effectively. This time, we have reason to hope, with no repetition of Dunkirk.
Thank you, Elmer Peterson. The National Broadcasting Company and its affiliated stations will bring you all the news of the invasion as rapidly as it is received. Stand by just a moment, please. Now for a special broadcast, a message of General Eisenhower. We take you to London.
National or by outside leaders, I say, follow the instructions you have received. To patriots who are not members of organized resistance groups, I say, continue your passive resistance, but do not needlessly endanger your lives. Wait until I give you the signal to rise and strike the enemy. The day will come when I shall need your united strength. Until that day, I call on you for the hard task of discipline and restraint. Citizens of France, I am proud to have again under my command the gallant forces of France. Fighting beside their allies, they will play a worthy part in the liberation of their homeland. Because the initial landing has been made on the soil of your country, I repeat to you with even greater emphasis my message to the peoples of other occupied countries in Western Europe. Follow the instructions of your leaders. A premature uprising of all Frenchmen may prevent you from being of maximum help to your country in the critical hour. Be patient. Prepare. As Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, there is imposed on me the duty and responsibility of taking all measures necessary to the prosecution of the war. Prompt and willing obedience to the orders that I shall issue is essential. Effective civil administration of France must be provided by Frenchmen. All persons must continue in their present duties unless otherwise instructed. Those who have made common cause with the enemy and so betrayed their country will be removed. When France is liberated from her oppressors, you yourselves will choose your representatives and the government under which you wish to live. In the course of this campaign for the final defeat of the enemy, you may sustain further loss and damage. Tragic though they may be, they are part of the price of victory. I assure you that I shall do all in my power to mitigate your hardships. I know that I can count on your steadfastness now, no less than in the past. The heroic deeds of Frenchmen who have continued the struggle against the Nazis and their vicious satellites in France and throughout the French Empire have been an example and an inspiration to all of us. This landing is but the opening phase of the campaign in Western Europe. Great battles lie ahead. I call upon all who love freedom to stand with us now. Keep your faith staunch. Our arms are resolute. Together we shall achieve victory.
That, ladies and gentlemen, was a rebroadcast of General Eisenhower's statement that he gave to the world at 4 o'clock this morning and which was carried by NBC just 8 hours ago. We'd like to call your attention to a broadcast, 1 full hour of news beginning at 12 o'clock, in which we'll bring you pickups from various portions of the country, including our nation's capital in Washington. We now bring you a program of music.
We continue now with Don Reed and an NBC orchestra.
Blue sky smiling at me, nothing but blue skies do I see. Bluebird
saw the sun shining so bright, never saw things going so right. Noticing the days hurrying by, when you're in love, my, how they fly. Blue days, all of them gone, nothing but blue skies from now on. Noticing the days hurrying by, when you're in love, my, how they fly. Blue days, all of them gone, nothing but blue skies from now charm, lips that once were mine, tender eyes that shine, they will light my way tonight. I'll see you in my
Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you stay tuned to the station to which you are listening for a full hour news broadcast beginning at 12 o'clock Eastern Wartime. That is exactly 4 minutes from now. 1 full hour of the latest invasion news.
try to whisper sweeter words in your ear, but somehow or other nothing seems quite so dear as this soft caressing word of love.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, the National Broadcasting Company is pleased to present another prayer in the busy schedule of this historic day. We are pleased to introduce Mr. DeWitt A. Davidson, past first reader of the Second Church Christ Scientist in New York. Mr. Davidson.
Pray for the prosperity of our country and for her victory under arms, that justice, mercy, and peace continue to characterize her government, and that they shall rule all nations. Pray that the divine presence may still guide and bless our chief magistrate, those associated with his executive trust, and our national judiciary. Give to our Congress wisdom, and uphold our nation with the right arm of his righteousness. In your peaceful homes, remember our brave soldiers, whether in camp or in battle. Oh, may their love of country and their faithful service thereof be unto them life preservers. May our Father, Mother God, who in times past hath spread for us a table in the wilderness and in the midst of our enemies, establish us in the most holy faith, plant our feet firmly on truth, the rock of Christ, the substance of things hoped for, and fill us with the life and understanding of God and goodwill towards men.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have just heard a prayer read by Mr. DeWitt A. Davidson, past first reader of Second Church Christ Scientist in New York.
This is Don Goddard in the NBC newsroom in New York with the latest summary of the invasion news. At this hour, there is every evidence that the armies of General Eisenhower, with the support of the Allied fleets and air forces, actually are expanding their beachheads on the coasts of France. From present descriptions, that beachhead, or that series of beachheads, is roughly a crescent of land swinging from the port of Cherbourg eastward to the port of Le Havre, around the estuary of the River Seine, where it joins the waters of the Channel. At last reports, this beachhead was about 10 miles wide at its widest place at the spot of greatest attack, the city of Caen. There are German reports that the Allies also have landed on the Channel Islands of Jersey and Guernsey, but those reports are unconfirmed at this hour. An earlier Swedish report said that our points of landing numbered about 12. This has not been confirmed either. The Germans, just heard by our monitors at NBC, also say that they expect new landings on the island of San Malo, another of the Channel Islands. And the latest report from our reconnaissance flyers, who already are piecing together several thousand pictures of the beachheads and producing evidence that our armies have secured their positions, are now in. And a bulletin at an Allied air base in England says that many Allied assault troops are now beyond the initial danger zone of total exposure in France. That also is a report from our reconnaissance flyers. The soldiers of the Allied nations have been on the shores of Europe for 12 hours and more now, and the Germans are beginning to come back with counter-assault at our beachheads. Just how heavy or how effective those counter-blows are is not clear. The Germans, in one breath, speak of meeting our armies along the whole 70 miles of French coastline, where we've secured ourselves. They speak of dealing effectively with our parachutists, and they say they've taken many of them prisoner. They also say their big coastal guns have come into play, and their fleets of fast E-boats and destroyers are in the Seine estuaries battling our navies. They claim they have sunk a cruiser and several landing barges. They are claiming no air successes to this point, however. They make these claims when at last they announced, after 9 hours of double talk on their domestic radio programs to the German people, that this really looked like the invasion the Allies had been talking about. And then they began to explain how many ships and planes and men we'd thrown into the fray. They even admitted that we'd penetrated rather far inland, and a distance of 10 or 12 miles, they said. The Nazis undoubtedly are readying their counterattacks. They may actually have launched some, but thus far, considering the magnitude of their operations, the number of men and the 4,000 ships and 11,000 Allied planes involved, our casualties have been comparatively light. That is an official statement, and in most places our men came ashore against little opposition, and the German Air Force was practically absent. In fact, our reconnaissance flyers report that we not only have secured our beachheads, but that some of our advanced spearheads are now penetrating southward, and they say, on the run. If they are, they're headed in the general direction of Paris, which lies only 125 miles to the south. A bulletin from London. German fighter planes have begun offering opposition now to Allied invasion forces. That's just in. Returning Allied pilots report numerous dogfights between Allied Typhoons and German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs in the southeast battle area of the invasion coast. One of the contributing factors in our initial successes there on the northern shores of France undoubtedly is our overwhelming superiority in air power. Air power to the smothering point. 11,000 planes in action today as our troops swept ashore. So Prime Minister Churchill told the House of Commons this morning. And add that to the accumulated death and destruction from thousands upon thousands of sorties of our air blitz to date. Also, that concentrated attack, the heaviest yet in a limited area that the RAF laid on the path to invasion that our armies were to take a few hours after last night. Add another 1,000-plane attack by American heavy bombers along that coast this morning, and then add the hundreds to come. A bulletin from Stockholm, a Berlin dispatch of the Scandinavian Telegraph Bureau, reports heavy fighting on both sides of Caen today, and says additional Allied invasion forces have been seen off Caen and off Cherbourg, undoubtedly reinforcements now being brought up. Yes, the Germans will react militarily as they did at Anzio, bitterly and with strength. Few observers doubt that at this hour. But we're ashore on the continent of Europe, and we shall stay there. There seems little doubt of that either. One German reaction is that of Hitler himself. He was reported to be rushing to France today to try his intuition against the masterly planning of General Eisenhower and his commanders. Another bulletin from Washington. Admiral Royal E. Ingersoll has just now officially revealed that U.S. battleships, cruisers, and destroyers of the United States Navy are participating in the invasion of Western Europe. The news of the invasion in Western Europe gave an added impetus to our armies in Italy. Rome went wild with jubilation. A dispatch just received from Rome says that Allied troops have smashed 5 miles north of the Tiber River now. 16 miles east of Rome, Allied troops have captured a spot known as Tivoli Junction. To the west of the Holy City, near the mouth of the Tiber, American forces have cut off and captured a force of 2,000 Germans. And there are more reports that the enemy is bewildered, demoralized in their mad scramble northward. The armies of General Alexander are sweeping ahead along a front of 70 miles there in Italy, and well north of Rome now. A late report from Washington. Soviet Ambassador Andrei A. Gromyko hails the opening of what he calls the second front, which Russia has so long demanded, and he predicts a speedy and a complete victory. In the first official Soviet reaction to the invasion news, the ambassador declares that he is confident that the combined blows of the powerful Allied coalition will ensure a speedy and complete victory over the enemy. The news of the invasion, he says, is good and encouraging. Gromyko conveys the wishes of the Soviet people for all successes to our allies in this most important military undertaking, which is speeding up our common victory over the mortal enemy of mankind, Hitlerite Germany. And London war authorities have heard this morning that Russia herself is now about ready to strike the Germans in great strength from the east and will launch major offensives before this week is over. And President Roosevelt has just summoned the top leaders, the chiefs of his Army and the Navy and the Air Forces, for a conference at the White House. And this afternoon he will meet the newsmen for his regular Tuesday afternoon news conference. And I understand that we are now to have a special broadcast from Rome, a special broadcast which will be heard from the city of London, from our headquarters in London. If London is ready, we will call them in. They will be ready in just a moment. We understand that one of our reporters is waiting over there, having just conferred with top leaders of the Allied armies. Go ahead, London.
This is W.W. Chaplin in London. The first post-invasion press conference has just been held in a long, narrow, bowling alley sort of room in the Ministry of Information. And do you know one startling thing that has come out of that conference? Well, sir, the invasion of Europe from the West was originally planned for yesterday, not today. But the weather prophets came along and shook their fingers and wagged their heads, and they said, no, you can't have your invasion then, because the weather is going to be just awful. So the generals took that dictum and they said, okay, they'd put off the invasion, the greatest amphibious operation in history, at least one day. And then what happened? Well, the next day, and that was yesterday, the weather was worse than ever. But those old weather prophets came barging out again and said, sure, it looks pretty terrible right now, but it's going to clear up fine. So the generals decided to let her go for last night, or rather early this morning. And sure enough, the weather cleared up and over they went. At this first press conference, sponsored by SHAEF, which means Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, there were representatives of air, sea, and land forces. Nationality didn't count, as it doesn't count in the actual military operations. Some of the men talking today were American and some were British, just as some of the men doing the fighting are American and some are British. And now, back to the newsroom in New York.
Thank you, Bill Chaplin. That was Bill Chaplin from our headquarters in London telling us the latest invasion news in London. As he told you, the Allied landings in France were postponed 24 hours due to bad weather. That was learned today at Allied headquarters, and Bill has just been up there talking with the Supreme Commanders. And back here in this country, from every city and town in America today, the news is almost the same. There is relief that the tension is over, that D-Day has come at last, that the first reports are almost unbelievably favorable. But that relief is a sober relief, and if any joy is felt, it's tempered by the knowledge that American boys must die to liberate Europe in this greatest invasion which the world has ever seen. That's the temper and the spirit of America today as we feel it here in the newsroom, as we get it from the dispatches which are pouring in by the thousands of words here at NBC, describing the reaction in all communities, big and little, of the United States and of the world. But at least the waiting is over, and Americans have looked at each other and said, yes, this is it. And they could take some comfort from the words of Winston Churchill, that grand old phrase-maker this morning, who told the House of Commons this morning that things were going according to plan, and he added, what a plan that is. Said Churchill, citing the 4,000 ships and 11,000 planes and our beachheads already driven into the Normandy Peninsula of France. Yes, what a plan. And we could take comfort, too, from the knowledge that President Roosevelt sat up all night behind blacked-out windows of the White House, in constant touch with the situation, knowing when every naval vessel was launched, when every amphibious landing barge sheered onto the beaches of France. The Americans could take comfort in the fact that the president was praying along with them, and that he was composing a prayer too, as soon as he finished his radio address last night, which he will ask Americans to intone with him when he speaks again tonight on the radio at 10 o'clock Eastern Wartime. The President's Secretary, Stephen Early, told this story to reporters in Washington this morning. He knew when the first barges started across the channel, and he knew when they landed. He knew of other operations in just as great detail. And that prayer, which President Roosevelt has composed, has been released for publication this afternoon in order that the public may be familiar with it and be able to join in with the President. And in part, it goes like this. My fellow Americans, in this poignant hour, I ask you to join me in prayer. Almighty God, our sons, pride of the nation, this day have set up a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. Lead them straight and true. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness to their faith. They will need thy blessings. Their road will be long and hard. And that is the NBC Newsroom in New York. This is Don Goddard speaking for NBC.
We pause briefly for station identification.
WEAF, New York.
At both ends of this zone of landings are two very important ports. On the eastern side is Le Havre, which is one of the most important commercial ports of France, from where most of the ships used to go to America. On the other side is Cherbourg, a great military port, which was also used as a commercial port. Between these two important harbors, a series of small ports, such as Grand Camp, Port-en-Bessin, and Trouville, can be very useful at the beginning of an invasion. Besides that, small ships can go up to the canal to Caen. It is now too early to try to guess what the Allied command's objective might be, but a landing along the Normandy coast would offer two possibilities. First, Le Havre coast is the nearest point to Paris. If the penetration was successful, it would lead the Allied forces toward the capital of France, not more than 120 miles away from by the Seine Valley. This would have a tremendous military and psychological effect. The other possibility, in the western part of the landing zone, would be to attack towards Avranches and cut the Normandy Peninsula completely. This would liberate an important area, which would be very useful for further landings of the Allies in France and perhaps lead to the invasion of the Brittany Peninsula. In case of heavy German counterattack, the Allies would then have the rather short defense line from Avranches to Caen. Anyway, according to the latest German reports, heavy fighting is now taking place in the Caen area. If this is true, the Allied troops fighting there are most probably paratroops. The intention would be to cut both the road and railway between Paris and Cherbourg by occupying the city of Caen, a city of now almost 100,000 population. This would isolate the northern part of Normandy, which would leave the German only secondary railways between Avranches and Saint-Lô and Cherbourg. Of course, all this is only conjecture, since we don't know anything about the High Command's intention, and we don't even know if this landing in Normandy will be the main effort of the Allied troops. It must be noticed that the Germans speak of very heavy bombing in the Calais zone, and it must be remembered, too, that hard fighting will probably take place before the Allies make their way through the deep German defense line. Now that the invasion has started, the tens of thousands of French people belonging to the underground movement, backed by the whole French population, will do their best in sabotage work to prevent the German from sending supplies, ammunition, and, above all, reinforcement to the points threatened by the Allied forces. For the French nation, for our beloved country, the dawn of liberation has come. All the patriots in France will do their duty, the same as the French soldiers have been doing theirs on all the fronts of battle since the beginning of the war.
Well, you just heard a first-hand expert analysis of the military possibilities along the invasion coast of France by Lieutenant Colonel Victor M. Morrison of the French military mission in Washington. I return you now to New York.
Columbia's news headquarters in New York, and now Columbia's military analyst,
Major George Fielding Elliott is going to analyze some of the German military reports which we have got so far. Here is Major Elliott.
The German radio has been busy telling the world what the German propaganda ministry, at any rate, possibly the German high command, thinks the Allies are up to. And while we must regard all enemy broadcasts with the usual suspicion, the strategic picture which they are presenting seems to fit together fairly well as a pattern. It seems to be the German idea that the port of Cherbourg is our main objective. This port lies at the northern tip of the Normandy Peninsula. It could be isolated by landing paratroops behind it, which the Germans say we have been doing. And they also report a major landing from landing craft covered by naval forces near St. Vaast-la-Hougue, which is on the eastern shore of the Normandy Peninsula and would threaten the rearward communications of Cherbourg. In addition, the Germans say that paratroops have come down at the important rail and road junction of Carentan, which controls the rail lines and highways leading into the peninsula from the southeast, that is, from the direction of Paris. These are German reports, but they seem to be the logical steps that the Allies would take if Cherbourg were, in fact, one of our major objectives, as it well may be, since it is a large and well-equipped port and would be very useful to a landing force. The Germans also say that other landings are taking place along the strip of coast between the Normandy Peninsula and the port of Le Havre, which lies at the mouth of the River Seine about 60 miles east of the Normandy Peninsula in a straight line, though the length of coast between the 2 points is about 100 miles. They say that we are landing in the mouths of the rivers along this coast, the principal of which are the River Bière and the River Orne. This would also be quite likely, as an attempt to get the port of Le Havre as well as Cherbourg would make a good deal of sense, as you have just heard Colonel Morrison tell you. But we must remember that these are all German reports so far, and we have had no word from any Allied source of the places where our landings are actually taking place, except for a British radio report just picked up by Columbia's shortwave listening station, which in a broadcast directed to Europe say that war correspondent dispatches state that the first reports of the Allied landings in Normandy are good. This is the first report we have had from any Allied source which has said that we were landing in Normandy. But that would seem to confirm, at least so far as general direction is concerned, the German reports that we have received. Another German report says places the strength of the forces which have been landed from the air as 4 parachute divisions. Well, actually, in the Allied forces, there is no such thing as a parachute division, but there is such a thing as an airborne division, which consists partly of parachute troops and partly of airborne troops in air transports and in gliders. The parachutists prepare the way by seizing a landing field, and then the transports and gliders come in when the landing field has been seized and prepared by the parachutists. If we landed anything like 4 airborne divisions behind the German lines to cut their communications, and especially to cut off the approaches to the Normandy Peninsula, it would seem that we would have a very good chance of success in this operation, or this would be an extremely strong force, and probably a good deal stronger than the Germans could concentrate in that locality within 24 or even 48 hours. So that the remarks of Prime Minister Churchill that the operation has been successfully begun seem in this respect to be borne out by the Germans themselves in their statement of the size of the force that has been landed. The Germans, of course, make various claims about wiping out parachute detachments and so on, but the German radio is given to these extravagant claims, and against them we can put the sober statement of the British Prime Minister that at least the first phase of our operations is being successfully carried out. And now, here once again is Bob Trout.
We've been listening to Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott, here in Columbia's news headquarters in New York City. We've had a bulletin from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, which has just come in from Great Britain. It says, German destroyers and E-boats are rushing into the operational area off the northern coast of France and no doubt are being dealt with by the Allies. This is the announcement which was made a few moments ago at Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force somewhere in Great Britain. An Allied military commentator there at headquarters announced that H hour for the invasion today ranged from 6 to 8 a.m. in Great Britain, which was midnight Monday to 2 a.m. Tuesday Eastern Wartime. German broadcasts, are saying that a furious battle between German E-boats and Allied warships is raging off Le Havre. But that is the latest official word from the military spokesman at Supreme Headquarters that German destroyers and E-boats are rushing into the operational area and no doubt are being dealt with. And now, once again, we're going to have word from Washington, D.C., so we take you now to the Pentagon building, which houses the War Department, and we take you to Washington, Joe McCafferty reporting.
Military experts here at the Pentagon building point out that this invasion, like so many we have accomplished in other phases of the war, is a waterborne operation, for there are no land avenues open in order for us to reach and engage the enemy. In the past, landings against opposition have been made in greatest force, besides the Pacific area, in Africa, Sicily, and Italy. They also emphasize that this is not General Dwight Eisenhower's first experience with an amphibious operation. He was in supreme command of the joint operation in Africa, in which Allied Army, Navy, and air units participated. In that operation, landings were made at or near Algiers, Oran, and Casablanca. The landing at Algiers was made, not at the port itself, but at beaches several miles from the city, and the initial force consisted of Rangers, infantry, artillery, and tanks. 2 airfields, as well as rail and road approaches, were immediately seized, and 16 hours after the landing, the French authorities agreed to surrender the city. In Sicily, the glider-borne air infantry, one of the finest trained units in the world, rugged from forced marches, from enduring all kinds of weather, from struggling through realistic maneuvers, this infantry from the air, our flying doughboys, there they played a major role. From these operations, and many, many more, the pattern for this D-Day had been fashioned. Most of the plotting, the working, the split-hair timing was done in this building, which houses the Secretary of War, his staff, and General George Marshall, the Chief of Staff. For military experts here hasten to point out that such a large-scale operation can't be planned one night and placed in operation the next morning. One point that was brought to my attention here was the fact that there was a staggering total of operational maps which went in with the platoons taking part in this landing. These maps had been made by the Corps of Engineers, the Army Air Forces, the best brains of G2, and thousands of GI soldiers with high degrees of skill. It might be well to point out that maps, in war, are as important as food. You can't travel without them. Most of these maps are based on aerial photography. Squadrons of P-38s and Spitfires were flown by specially trained pilots, whose regular training was augmented with 8 months of specialized navigation and instrument flying. Their task was to photograph enemy territory in solo missions, and they flew with 6-inch and 24-inch cameras as their only defense. I have talked today with Air Corps officers who point out that the Air Force has been taking part in aerial invasion for many long months. On the eve of invasion, targets for the 9th Air Force, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings were concentrated in a relatively narrow but important urban area of northern France and Belgium, crisscrossed with roads and rail lines from Germany, leading to the first line of pillboxes and trenches, and dotted with strategic air bases and cities. Now, these Air Corps officers emphasize, the 9th Air Force fighter bombers, as they did before D-Day, strike at large stationary targets, putting the finishing touches on the blanket bombing of the medium and light bombers of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force. Fighter bombing from British bases is the most recent phase of the daylight air offensive. This huge office building, one of the largest and most modern in the world, is now beginning to take on its usual hustle-bustle of the working day. Civil service workers are filing down the long corridors, walking among the officers who are wearing their summer suntans. The usual laughter of young stenographers going to work is missing. They are talking earnestly to one another about Tom, Jack, or Ted, who are over there. The officers walk hurriedly to their rooms. Let no one tell you that those in government are so close to the forest they can't see the trees. They feel the impact of D-Day, for they have watched it develop. Almost every office in this huge building, which houses some 35,000 people, had a hand in doing something towards preparing for the invasion. Secret and confidential material and plans for D-Day have gone through hundreds of trusted hands. One colonel, who has been keeping a chart on absenteeism, said that for the past few months the chart hadn't been used. They're always on the job, he said. Although only a chosen few knew when the day would arrive, the atmosphere here in the Pentagon building has been tense for several weeks. Only yesterday, when I paid a routine visit to the Bureau of Public Relations, my escort past the police guard said, "I have a feeling that something is going to happen, and happen soon." I return you now to New York.
Columbia's news headquarters in New York once again. Bob Trout speaking. Now let's go over the latest news that has come in while we've been listening to our correspondent in Washington, D.C. And to remind you once again, some of this might be a bit repetitious because our audience is gradually growing as the morning continues in New York, and as people get up who haven't heard about the invasion. We shall continue to repeat the essential news as we run in the new facts which do come in. Now, here's the first one. London, June 6. Royal Air Force bombers last night blasted the northwest German railway center of Osnabrück, the Air Ministry tells us, and all planes returned safely. That answers our question about what the heavy strategic bombers were going to do once the invasion started. Some people thought they would be called off strategic bombing altogether and would be used directly to support the invasion, but last night, which was D-Day, Royal Air Force bombers were out after the northwest German railway center of Osnabrück, the Air Ministry tells us, and they also tell us something which is rather unusual. All the Royal Air Force bombers returned safely to their bases in Britain. Earlier I told you that at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force in Britain, a spokesman had said German destroyers and E-boats are rushing into the operational area off the northern coast of France and no doubt are being dealt with by the Allies. Those are the words of a military spokesman at Supreme Headquarters in Great Britain, and they were released about 30 minutes ago. Not quite that, as a matter of fact. A bulletin from an 8th United States Army Air Force photo reconnaissance base in Britain tells us Allied landing forces have established beachheads on the coast of northern France and are slashing their way inland. Now, that's the very brief word that we have just had from a United States Army Air Force photo reconnaissance base in Great Britain. That means that a reconnaissance pilot has looked down and has seen the beachheads which now exist on the coast of northern France, and the pilot has come back with the word that the troops who landed and established those beachheads are beginning to move inland. Of course, we don't know how far they've gone. Actually, that's somewhat similar to some of the news that Prime Minister Winston Churchill had given in his statement in the House of Commons, which we have gone over briefly earlier, but as it does contain the very latest details and some very definite details, let's go over it again. Prime Minister Winston Churchill told the House of Commons that massed airborne landings have gone off successfully behind the enemy's lines in France. He said the landings along the beaches are still proceeding, but that the fire of enemy shore batteries has been largely silenced. The Prime Minister noted that many of the German ground defenses, especially those in the water, which we ourselves thought might be stiff to overcome, have proved to be less difficult than had been anticipated before the invasion began. And the Prime Minister revealed that more than 4,000 ships took part in the combined operation, and that we now have about 11,000 first-line planes to support the ground troops. So far, continued Mr. Churchill, everything is proceeding according to plan, and, he said, what a plan it is. The Prime Minister admitted that the vast operation, or rather he said that the vast operation is undoubtedly the most complicated and the most difficult that's ever been undertaken in the history of the world. But, he said, we shall furnish the enemy with a succession of surprises in the course of the fighting. And he warned that in the weeks to come, the battle will grow in scale and intensity. And that word, weeks, in the statement of the Prime Minister this morning is a word that we should remember. Here's word from Russia that the Moscow radio has told the Russian people about it. At 6:45 in the morning Eastern War Time, in other words, about half an hour ago, in a Russian language broadcast, which was recorded by the Federal Communications Commission in this country, the Moscow radio gave the Russian people the news of the landing of Allied armies on the northern coast of France. The Russian broadcast was given under a London dateline, and it reported the first communique of Supreme Headquarters factually and without comment. We've already given you that one-sentence communique several times, many times I should say, and that communique, while it's the only one that has been given out, is really outdated now by the remarks of the Prime Minister in the House of Commons. Well, from time to time during this night-long broadcast, which began almost just shortly after midnight last night, from time to time we've been waiting to see what Tokyo was going to say. And now we have the first reaction of the Tokyo radio to the news that the liberation of the continent has begun. Here it is. Tokyo radio's first reaction to the invasion was a broadcast in the German language, beamed to Europe, according to the CBS correspondent in San Francisco, who quotes Claude Buss, director of the Pacific Division of the Office of War Information. And the Tokyo broadcast says, quote, "We have just learned with deep concern of the landings by the Allies on the coast of France. We expect," says Tokyo, "that they will be quickly annihilated by the courageous German armies." That's the full text of the Japanese announcement, a very short announcement, given in the German language. And that, so far, is all that Tokyo has said about it. That's a broadcast which Tokyo put out for foreign consumption. The foreign, in this case, means us. And so far, the OWI on the West Coast tells us the Japanese people have not been told the news that the invasion has begun. Now, those of you particularly who stayed with us all night, who began to listen to this all-night-long broadcast shortly after midnight last night, when we began with only the German reports, the German bulletins and announcements that the invasion had begun, those of you who began to listen to us then before our own high command had said that the invasion had indeed begun will be especially interested in this warning from Elmer Davis, which Mr. Davis made at his office in Washington this morning. Elmer Davis says, "Despite the Germans' accuracy in announcing the invasion before the official Allied communique, German broadcasts should not be relied on in the future." Elmer Davis said the reason the Germans made the announcement so quickly before the Allied communique was released, a couple of hours before, in fact, was possibly that the Germans are trying to build up a reputation for accuracy so that they can then put one over on the Allies later. That's the way Elmer Davis puts it. He says that later on they may try to put one over on us, and that's why they're trying to build up their reputation for accuracy. And then Mr. Elmer Davis asked all Americans to remember that Joseph Goebbels is in business for his health and not for ours. And now at this time at Columbia's News headquarters in New York, we're going to repeat a very colorful broadcast made earlier this morning on this network by CBS correspondent Richard C. Hotlet, who was speaking from London. Those of you who have been with us all along heard Mr. Hotlet's broadcast, and now Mr. Hotlet's report will be read by Joe King.
The Allied forces landed in France early this morning. I watched the first landing barges hit the beach exactly on the minute of H hour. I was in a 9th Air Force Marauder flying at 4,500 feet along 20 miles of the invasion coast. From all I could see during these first few minutes, there was nothing stopping the assault parties from getting ashore. We spent about half an hour over enemy territory. We flew over and bombed some of the coastal fortifications. But except for some light flak from inland positions and from some kites firing at us, we saw no enemy gunfire. The only other sign of life in enemy territory were some white and yellow parachutes dotting the ground where our paratroopers had hit the ground. The weather is favorable for the operation. Offshore, Allied warships were bombing the enemy coast, and they seemed to be doing it without any opposition. As far as we were concerned, there was no opposition from the air either. The Luftwaffe just didn't seem to be there. What I saw was literally the last minute of the invasion preparations and the first minute of invasion. We were low, but we were traveling fast, and we could not tell how the battle for the beaches would develop. But if the ground action goes as smoothly as the air preparation, we can hope for the best. I went in with a bomber group, probably the hottest group in the 9th Air Force. Our mission was to plaster the invasion beach and some coastal fortifications with bombs 7 minutes before our assault parties came ashore. This group was chosen for the hair-trigger work because of its previous superb record. Well, we delivered, and we delivered on time. This is the way it worked. Last night, we were told briefing would be at 3 o'clock. We got up at 2, had griddle cakes and fried spam for breakfast, went into the long hut that serves as briefing room. The doors were closed, and the commanding officer announced that the invasion had begun. He said that since midnight, 3 hours before our paratroopers, some 20,000 of them had been landing in France. I'm reading you a dispatch by Richard C. Hotlet of CBS's London staff. Now to continue. The men cheered. The men went on to say that the Air Forces were being called for their maximum contribution. There were going to be more than 1,500 Fortresses and Liberators flying in ahead of us. Hundreds of medium bombers, too, were going to precede us. And our group was to wind up the pre-invasion bombing. When he said this, the men really cheered. To top it off, we were going to have cover from more than 2,500 Allied fighters. The colonel made it plain that nothing was to be left to chance. The weather in the target area had been unsettled and cloudy, and if we were going to deliver precision bombing, we were to have to fly below the clouds, and that we could go down and bomb from 1,000 feet. When he said that not a man blinked an eye, despite the fact that such a low altitude counts as suicide with the marauders. It was still dark when we took off, but one by one those marauders roared down the runway and took off. An hour and a half later, we were out over the English Channel. First, we couldn't see anything at all except a few stray vessels. Great care had been taken to keep our ships from firing at their own planes. Every single bomber and fighter had been painted overnight with special markings on wings and fuselage. And the direction we were to fly, the way we were to turn if we got into trouble, and the recognition signals we were to give had all been very carefully worked out. Even so, when we passed over the first few barges, we had the uncomfortable feeling that we were being shot at. It didn't last long. We were out and away in a matter of minutes. By this time, it was getting on, and the sun was painting the sky a bright orange color on our left. Below us, the English Channel was a fine deep blue. There were a few white caps, but we got the impression that it wasn't very rough down below. About 5 miles off the French coast, we saw planes in a steep dive laying a smoke screen. Just about the same minute, the pilot said he saw fires on the shore. I looked as hard as I could, and there down to the left were some naval vessels. They looked like cruisers, firing broadsides onto the shore. Their guns belched with flame and smoke. Once I saw a fountain of water not far from one of them, which may have been a shot from the shore or a depth charge. Near the cruisers were dozens of landing craft of all kinds, hardly visible in the early morning haze. All this while, we saw medium bombers and fighters crisscrossing on the way to the target without a sign of a German plane. Then, as we turned in over the coast, about 10 minutes before H hour, we saw a fast assault boat race along parallel to the beach, laying a smoke screen. From the way the screen lay, smooth and even, it looked as if there were no wind. We're continuing to read you a dispatch by Richard C. Hottelet of the CBS London staff. Now we continue. We opened our bomb bay doors. Light flak began to come up after us. Off to our left, not near at all, firing only sporadically. The flights ahead of us dropped their bombs. The guns on the ships offshore resumed fire. The bombs and the shells burst together on the target. There were sheets of flame down below, then rolling balls of brown and black smoke. 4,500 feet up, our plane was rocked by the concussion. We got the stench of the explosives. We dropped our bombs as scheduled. And just then we saw down below on our left dozens and scores of white streaks as the assault boats raced over the blue water to the beach, leaving their white wakes stretched out behind them. As we turned away from the target, we saw the boats hit the beach. Then we took evasive action, and I couldn't see anymore. Down below, except for some more sporadic smoke, it was a dead country. No sign of life, no vehicles on road, no troop movements. And all the way in, we saw our marauders weaving in and out in perfect formation above us, below us, and around us, on all sides. We didn't see a single one of our planes in distress. The mission wasn't the way we had figured it. We had expected to see German fortifications give back blow for blow with our ships. There was no sign of it. We had expected to see the Luftwaffe out in its full remaining strength to try to stop our planes or at least strike a blow against our landing craft. We didn't see either. We had expected to find enemy territory full of anti-aircraft, alive with reserves moving into threatened areas. We didn't see that. The circumstances of our flight, the fact that we got there simultaneously with the invading troops and left in a minute, make it impossible to draw any far-reaching conclusions on how the battle is going. But one thing we can say already, and that is our air supremacy over the coastal invasion zone today is not seriously challenged. And that is the report of Richard C. Hottelet, CBS London correspondent, who was over the invasion area in a bomber. And now, back to Bob Trout.
That was Joe King reading the dispatch from Richard C. Hottelet. It was not exactly a cable dispatch. As a matter of fact, Mr. Hottelet first gave this report as a broadcast direct from London, one of the many broadcasts that were coming in direct from Supreme Headquarters in Great Britain sometime during the night. those of you who have been with us all night heard Mr. Hotlet's broadcast direct from Great Britain after he had returned from his flight in the Marauder. Here's a dispatch which has just come in, very brief. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. It says, as the battle opening the Western Front raged in northern France, General Eisenhower occupied a lonely post on the British side of the Channel. After inspecting parachute troops before they went into the battle, the director of history's greatest amphibious strike stood on the roof of a house, watching the huge air armadas roar across the Channel. And now at this point, some of us, I think, would like to know more about landing craft. And so here at Columbia's news headquarters in New York is Major George Fielding Elliott, Columbia's military analyst, who is going to give us a little talk about landing craft at this point. And then later on, we shall continue to give you the news as it comes in to keep you up to date and to refresh you with what we have already given you before. Here is Major Elliott.
Before beginning to talk to you about landing craft, here is a dispatch which has just come in, dated at Army Group Headquarters. General Bernard Montgomery, on the eve of battle, told correspondent, "I personally have absolute and complete confidence in the outcome. The party is in first-class shape to win the match," said Montgomery. He believed Field Marshal Erwin Rommel would aim at defeating the operations on the beaches. That is to say, General Montgomery believes that Rommel will not conduct what is called an elastic defense, but will try to throw the Allied landing forces right back off the beach into the sea. But as you have just heard in the reading of Mr. Hotlet's dispatch, that does not appear to be what has happened in the area which Mr. Hotlet had the opportunity of observing. "We are a great Allied team," Montgomery continued, "a terrific Allied team. The integration of the British Empire and America going out to battle together. I don't think any other two nations could have done it. I don't know when the war is going to end, but I don't believe the Germans can go on much longer with this business," Montgomery continued. "The German soldier is terribly good, but I don't think the German general is as good as he used to be. He has been on the defensive a very long time, and I believe it must affect his mentality." There, I think General Montgomery was speaking of General Rommel, his old opponent in Africa, who is now the commander of the German reserve forces, that is, the German forces which are going to make the main counterattack. So the German general in supreme command of the anti-invasion forces is Marshal General Gerd von Rommel, who is Rommel's superior. And now, to get on to the question of these landing craft, which are carrying our men across the Channel and delivering them on the coast of France. I might introduce that subject by reading a dispatch from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, which I think has been read previously in these broadcasts, which says as follows: "German destroyers and E-boats are rushing into the operational area off the northern coast of France and no doubt are being dealt with by the Allies. It would be natural for the Germans to put what few destroyers they have, they don't have many left, and their E-boats, that is, their fast and heavily armed motorboats, in an attempt to attack our landing craft." Now let's see what some of these landing craft are like. There are well over 50 different types of landing craft in service, each designed for a particular task in the complex operation of seaborne invasion. The uses of landing craft do not end once the first wave of invasion is past and the beachhead secured. These craft continue to bring in the equipment and supplies from the bigger ships until docking facilities are available. Landing craft may also be needed to help the Army in land operations. In the crossing of the Volturno River in Italy, for example, 4 tank landing craft, escorted by 2 motor launches, took the tanks across for the Army. And we must remember also that landing craft are vulnerable to artillery fire and to air attack, and usually a good many of them are damaged in the course of invasion operations. The damage to landing craft has usually exceeded expectations, so that after the first few days there are not so many of them available. Now, the following is a list of some of the types of landing craft with the details of how they work. The assault landing craft, known as the LCA, was the first of the modern type of landing craft, and it is an armored, flat-bottomed steel boat which operates under its own power. The wheelhouse is a small cabin in the forward part of the craft, and the ramp is small and on a level with the gunwale. The troops are carried in 2 bays, fore and aft, covered by armored decking. The capacity of the LCA is about 35 men. These crafts carry out the first assault landings. That is, each of them carries one of the assault groups which were described to you in an earlier broadcast. They are driven right onto the beach, and the bow flap drops down to allow the troops to run straight ashore. This landing craft has a crew of 4. Then there are 2 other types of a similar nature. There's landing craft personnel, similar to the LCA but slightly smaller, and the mechanized landing craft, which has a very shallow draft and with twin screws, and is also run right up on the beach. A support landing craft is not really a landing craft at all. It's a powerfully armed ship whose task in an invasion is to go in close to the beaches and cover the initial landing. It has smoke apparatus and mortars, in addition to machine guns and light cannons. The landing craft flak, LCF, is a floating anti-aircraft battery. It, too, is not really a landing craft at all. Then we come to the LCT, our landing craft tank. A typical LCT is about 200 feet long, displaces 350 tons, with a draft of 3 feet forward and 7 feet aft, enabling it to run up on a shelving beach. It's a seagoing vessel driven by twin diesel engines and has a crew of 12 men in all. 2/3 of it are occupied by the tanks or other vehicles, which are placed on a reinforced iron platform with a corrugated surface to prevent them from slipping. These craft are capable of carrying a number of tanks or other vehicles, trucks, armored troop carriers, and so forth, or of guns. When loaded, the vehicles are driven in stern first, packed close together, and lashed in place while at sea. The LCT has a hinged ramp in the bows, which enables the tanks or other vehicles to be driven straight ashore. The LCT, incidentally, is not a good seaboat, her construction making her easily affected by wind and tides and difficult to maneuver. Nevertheless, the LCTs in the Mediterranean have steamed great distances. One group of them, for example, was at sea off and on for 2,000 hours and steamed about 10,000 miles in that time. The LCI, or landing craft infantry, is one of the most important types of landing craft, and one of those of latest design also. The troops are landed directly on the beach by the inclined ramps to port and starboard, which are let down on each side of the bow. This type is considerably larger than the LCA, that is the assault group, which holds 30 to 35 men. This one will hold a full rifle company of infantry, about 200 men altogether. Then we come to a still larger ship, the LSD, or landing ship tank. These ships are the major tank landing craft. They have a shallow draft and are able to go close inshore to discharge their cargoes, the vehicles being driven directly onto the beach from the bows, which open for the purpose. 2 huge doors opening to port and starboard. They resemble an oil tanker when seen in profile, with a funnel aft, and they're really large ships. They're being vessels of approximately 5,500 tons. The landing ship infantry is the corresponding size in the infantry type of ship, a large vessel of several thousand tons, somewhat resembling a small ocean liner. It's the main infantry carrying unit of the invasion craft. It anchors offshore and lowers barges or assault craft from her davits in which the troops are carried ashore. This type of ship is not usually run up on the beach. Then there is the very useful little amphibious craft known as the duck. It also is not a landing craft in the normal sense, because it can float and propel itself in the water and also on shore. At sea, it looks like a square-bowed launch, the body being boat-shaped and boat-sided. Ashore, it is a 6-wheeled, 2.5-ton truck. It has a normal motor engine, which is thoroughly protected from the sea. The engine actuates a propeller at sea, and it drives the wheels when the duck is on land. The changeover is made by a single movement of a special lever. Ducks are carried on board ship as deck cargo and are lowered over the side when they are needed by derricks. The men slide down ropes into them, and supplies are lowered in the normal way. The ducks were first used in the Sicilian campaign, and they've also been used in the Pacific by our Marines and other landing forces. The naval vessels chiefly concerned with the close convoying of the invasion armada are minesweepers, trawlers, motor launches, flagships, destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft carriers. The minesweeper, of course, has the task of sweeping up enemy submarine mines, which might otherwise blow up the landing craft, and these will be sowed pretty thickly offshore in areas where the enemy expects us to come in. Trawlers are used also for the same purposes. Flagships are just what the name implies, anti-aircraft ships for the protection of the landing craft against enemy air attack. Destroyers and corvettes deal with attempts by enemy destroyers or E-boats to attack the landing craft. Such attacks as have been reported in the dispatch that I read to you at the beginning of this broadcast. And larger craft may also be necessary if the presence of enemy cruisers may be suspected. The enemy has a few large warships left, and of course he may decide to use them, to throw them in to do what damage they can do. We may be very sure that the Allied naval forces are taking adequate precautions against any such attempt. Finally, aircraft carriers may be necessary in order to protect the flanks of the movement across the channel against any attempt by the enemy to attack them from up or down channel. They may be out a considerable distance where the channel is wider, or even well out at sea watching for the approach of enemy naval vessels attempting to raid the channel from either from the North Sea or from the Atlantic side. This may give you some idea of the landing craft which our men are using, which are conveying them across the channel to France, and some idea also of the immense complexity of the operation which we are now undertaking. And now, here once again is Bob Trout.
You've been listening to Major George Fielding Elliott, Columbia's military analyst, here at Columbia's news headquarters in New York. Now, before going on with our running coverage of the invasion, which has now started in northern France, let me tell you briefly a few of our immediate plans. In approximately 4 minutes from now, just before 7:45, we're going to pause for 30 seconds for station identification, and then at 8 o'clock Eastern Wartime, we're going to switch to London for another one of those pool broadcasts. Pool, you know, means that the correspondents are pooling their copy in this early stage of the invasion. We've already had several of these pool broadcasts in which we've heard correspondents who represent several various organizations. Among them, of course, we heard our own correspondents. For instance, Richard C. Hottelet, who made the trip over the enemy coast in a Marauder plane and who, sometime during last night, spoke to us directly from Supreme Headquarters in Great Britain and described his flight for us. Also, later in the afternoon, King George VI of Great Britain will broadcast at 3 p.m. Eastern Wartime. 3 p.m. Eastern Wartime, and of course, the Columbia Network will carry the broadcast speech of King George, which will be made in London. General de Gaulle has arrived in London. We got that word some time ago, hours ago, sometime during the night, as a matter of fact. We don't know whether he will broadcast, but it's quite possible. And, of course, if General de Gaulle does make a broadcast, which is offered for rebroadcast here in the United States, you will hear that, too, over this network. Now, we have quite a few things that we could tell you. Here's a little additional detail on the statement which Prime Minister Winston Churchill made in the House of Commons. And we find in this latest edition that there was grim news as well as good in Mr. Churchill's statement. In discussing the Battle of the Anzio beachhead in Italy, which was established last January and which was held against heavy German counterattacks, Prime Minister Churchill said the Allies lost about 20,000 men and the Germans 25,000. Those are the figures in the Battle of the Anzio beachhead, which Mr. Churchill has given to the House of Commons today. The Battle of the Anzio beachhead in Italy cost the Allies some 20,000 men and cost the Germans some 25,000 men. But Mr. Churchill said the Anzio landing had in the end borne good fruit by forcing Adolf Hitler to send south of Rome 8 or 9 divisions, which he might well have needed elsewhere. The latest word from Supreme Headquarters A brief dispatch which has just come into Columbia's news headquarters here in New York says, Allied troops have secured a beachhead and dug in. Military circles here heard early this afternoon. That's a rather interesting wording. That is not an official communique by any means. All it says is that the dispatch from Supreme Headquarters in Great Britain is quoting military circles there as saying that Allied troops have secured a beachhead and have dug in. And then it goes on to say simply, it is not known presently how deep the penetrations are. Now, just to tell you once again briefly of our plans, at 8 o'clock, that will be in 15 minutes from now approximately, we are going to bring a broadcast to you direct from London, a pool broadcast, and we hope that you will be with us as we continue our invasion coverage. We've been broadcasting all through the night, starting shortly after midnight last night when the Germans first began to put out their reports that the invasion had begun. It was some hours later, it was 3:30 in New York, when the first communique was released in Great Britain, and we learned that the German reports had this time been right and that the invasion of northern France had indeed begun. Well, we shall hear our next broadcast direct from London in approximately 15 minutes, a pool broadcast. And now we're coming to the time when we pause for 30 seconds for station identification. This is Bob Trout speaking to you from Columbia's news headquarters in New York City as Columbia continues its invasion coverage. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System. Broadcasting from America to France for the Office of War Information, in addition to doing his regular broadcasts for CBS audiences here in our own country. And now, here is Mr. Calvin.
You heard Bob Trout report a few minutes ago the news from Stockholm about the Allies landing at 12 points on the coast of France between Le Havre and the Cherbourg Peninsula, with the evident aim, according to these dispatches, of driving straight on to Paris. If that is the way our drive is developing, it's significant to recall President Roosevelt's words only 2 nights ago to the effect that Rome was the first of Europe's great capitals to fall to Allied arms and that 2 others were due to be captured, by which he may well have meant that Paris was next on the list. At any rate, you can well imagine the excitement of the excitable French people as news from our radio is flashed to them and they see the Allies landing in their own beloved Normandy countryside for the liberation of which they've waited so long. We can be sure that the French underground is offering valuable aid to our landing forces and that sabotage of the German defenses is being carried out wherever possible. Some Frenchmen may have been disappointed that General de Gaulle, who has now arrived in England from Algiers, has not as yet broadcast to France, so far as we know. Those speeches by the Premier of Belgium and the Premier of Holland were broadcast hours ago to their people. But it is announced that General de Gaulle will broadcast later in the day. It'll be useful at this stage of the invasion news to give you a little background on the kind of country that our boys are going on into in northern France. Northern France, the only definite locality term used so far by the official Allied communique issued this morning at 3:32 a.m. Eastern Wartime from General Eisenhower's headquarters. Militarily, northern France includes an area approximately 100 miles deep, extending from the frontier of Belgium through Paris to the mouth of the Loire River on the Bay of Biscay. This area is roughly rectangular. I hope you have a map in front of you now to follow me, and is bounded on the south by the Loire, Oise, and Sambre rivers. 2 peninsulas thrust out into the English Channel. One is the province of Brittany in the extreme west, from which so far we've had no reports of any Allied invasion activity, and the other is the peninsula known as Cotentin, on which Cherbourg, that great port familiar before the war to so many transatlantic American travelers, where Cherbourg is located. In general, this area of northern France is a rolling plateau varying in elevation from 200 to 650 feet. However, there are some low mountains in Brittany and another low range in South Normandy. In the area where our boys are reported landing, not officially by the Allies, but by the Germans and by these roundabout dispatches from Stockholm, in the area where our boys are reported landing, some of the finest, broadest, and best beaches in the world are located, ideal for landings of landing craft and landing craft tanks. In places, the plateau inland extends all the way to the English Channel, with cliffs along the seashore averaging about 200 feet in height. This, of course, would make infantry landings more difficult, but not impossible. In other places, the plateau drops before reaching the coast, and there are wide sandy beaches, such as I've just been describing, with good access to the interior, and where, according to CBS correspondent Richard Hartlett, who passed over that area in a plane not many hours ago when the invasion was launched, our troops were not meeting any opposition that was visible to that correspondent from the plane. These cliffs along the Normandy shore are seldom more than 200 feet high, and they're usually sloping and covered with soil. This makes it possible for foot troops to scale them, but they are an obstacle to vehicles. We won't be able to get tanks in that way. However, there are numerous streams cutting through the cliffs along the Channel invasion coast and forming ravines and valleys to the ports and the beaches. Through some of these breaks in the cliff line, there are railroads and main highways. Through others, there are paths which could be widened and graded for the passage of military vehicles. Back of the coastal area, all of northern France is thickly cultivated and studded with towns and cities. There's a dense network of both surface roads and railroads. We don't know, of course, the extent of damage that our bombing has done to intercept these facilities. In the invasion, the roads will probably be of greater importance than the railroads, the highways, that is, where the French underground will be able to offer us valuable assistance. French saboteurs are expected to interrupt communications by rail. The indications so far are that the Germans will have to depend mainly on these highways for the rapid movement of their troops. And it may therefore be necessary to land parachute forces in increasing numbers to seize these key road junctions. I turn the microphone now back to Bob Trout here in the CBS newsroom in New York.
Ned Calmer has been giving us some facts about the coastal area of France, and now here on the other side of me in our CBS News headquarters is our war correspondent, Quentin Reynolds, who is going to discuss some of the German defenses which Allied troops may have met this morning on the coast of northern France. Mr. Reynolds will give us this discussion based on his experiences at Dieppe, at Salerno, and also the information which he has got by studying Royal Air Force reconnaissance photographs. And now here is Quentin Reynolds.
All night long, while giving you the brief official communiques and eyewitness reports of our correspondents who have returned from France to London, we have been attempting to visualize the pattern of this invasion. Gradually, it seems to be taking shape. Our army struck, according to the German radio, between Le Havre and Cherbourg, in the Baie de la Seine, a field of operations stretching roughly about 60 miles. This is about 50 miles southwest of Dieppe. Ned Calmer has just described the terrain of that part of France to you. Now, apparently we attained something at 2:25 a.m. this morning, which not even the most optimistic military observer hoped that we would attain. That is, tactical surprise. We landed on the sandy beaches in the Deauville and Trouville area. For months, the Germans have sneered that these beaches were absolutely invulnerable. They didn't think that we'd dare to land on sandy beaches. Sandy beaches can be mined, and it is almost impossible to land on a beach that is heavily mined without incurring great casualties. The beaches in front of Dieppe, where we landed in August 1942, were not sandy. They were not mined. That's because they were what the British call shale beaches. No sand, merely boulders and small rocks, rounded by the constant action of the tides. You can't mine shale beaches because the water, striking the shore, keeps shifting the rocks and the boulders, and this motion is enough to set off the mines. But mines buried underneath the sand remain there until an unwary foot treads upon them, or the weight of a tank or a truck sets them off. When we went into the Bay of Salerno on September 8th last, General Mark Clark said to me, "We're spitting right into the mouth of the lion." General Eisenhower, apparently convinced by the success of the Salerno operation, decided to spit once more into the mouth of the lion. To his enemy's strength, and the enemy's strength was not good enough to keep us from landing. This part of the coast has always been considered the best defended portion of the entire French coast. In short, Eisenhower and Montgomery attempted to trump Germany's ace, and early reports indicate that General Ike took the trick. We landed on some of the best beaches in the world, long, rolling, sandy beaches, once the playground of Europe. But somehow or other, we managed to neutralize the thousands of mines which must have lurked under the hard, innocent-looking white sand. Our sappers have been well trained in the business of making enemy mines innocuous. They know all about the so-called S-mines, which our men call the bouncing baby. They know about the telemines and the tripwires, which will set off half a dozen buried grenades if you stumble over them. They know about the three-pronged igniters that stick a few inches above the ground. They can see these. They can't see the so-called platamines, almost as thin as phonograph records, which are buried a foot below the surface of the ground. We know that early this morning, the first men to dash out of the landing barges were the sappers with their detecting devices. These reveal the presence of all metal mines. They do not reveal the presence of the plastic mines the Germans used in Sicily and on the road to Rome. But perhaps by now the genius of our scientists has found an answer to these, too. The Army authorities are silent on this subject. There are cabanas and small country villas behind the beaches of Deauville. Our men knew all about them and about the danger that lurked inside them. The Germans are masters of the booby trap. Our men had orders never to open a door of any of these buildings. You turn the doorknob and a bomb will explode. Instead, our men were told to send a blast of Tommy gun fire at the doorknob, shoot off the lock, push the door open with a long stick, and then enter. And when they took refuge in these villas and in the farmhouses and barns which dot the French countryside and back of the beaches, they had further orders. They were told not to move a chair or a table, not to straighten a picture on the wall, not to pick up a fountain pen or pencil they might find on a desk or table. All of these might be and undoubtedly were booby traps. At Dieppe, every farmhouse was mined or booby-trapped in this manner. These were merely some of the initial barriers our men encountered, and which we have all seen here in RAF reconnaissance photographs. We know this from the photographs and from past experiences in amphibious landings. How successfully our men conquered these diabolically clever defenses can best be realized by the fact that some 3 hours ago, the German radio admitted that American troops were fighting 10 miles inland.
That was Quentin Reynolds, who's been speaking to us here at Columbia's news headquarters in New York. Now, just to remind you again, we're going to bring you a broadcast from England in approximately 30 seconds, but now we break for 30 seconds for station identification. Bob Trout speaking at our news headquarters in New York. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
This is D-Day, the day of the Allied invasion of Western Europe, and CBS World News brings you the invasion reports of its correspondents at home and abroad, called in by Alan Jackson. This is the situation at the moment. Allied troops have landed along a 100-mile stretch of the French coast. Thousands of paratroopers and glider-borne forces have descended behind the enemy lines. Thousands of Allied warplanes are supporting the operation, and so far, it appears to have met little opposition. The greatest naval armada in history took the troops across the Channel. And now here is Alan Jackson, one of Columbia's news editors.
American radio correspondents in London are ready now with the latest details of the invasion. First, we hear from CBS correspondent Richard C. Huttlett. Go ahead, London. This is Court calling London. Go ahead, Richard.
Invasion of Europe. Speaking in the House of Commons, Mr. Churchill said that these landings are the real thing. He said this after German radio reports had tried to insinuate it might be a false alarm or a diversion which might be called off. The Prime Minister also said that the fire of the shore batteries has largely been quelled. I can confirm that in part because this morning, precisely at H hour, I flew over 20 miles of the invasion coast in a Marauder and did not see a German coastal battery fire a shot. Mr. Churchill revealed that the invading forces had not found the German underwater obstacles as difficult as we had feared, and that the landings on the beaches are still going on. Which means that within 6 hours of the commencement of seaborne operations, the invasion of Europe has cleared the first hurdle. Not only that, but the progress has been so satisfactory in this initial phase that Mr. Churchill felt able to say, we may have had tactical surprise. This is excellent news. But it's well to remember that the critical period of an operation on this scale is expected to last at least a week. The men are on the beach now, but until enough heavy equipment is ashore to deal with German counterattacks, we are not out of danger. We must expect those counterattacks momentarily. We may be cautious here in London this morning, but don't get the impression we're gloomy. Far from it. The strength that's been thrown into this operation is staggering. Mr. Churchill said that more than 4,000 ships and several thousand smaller craft have already crossed the channel. He told of the mass airborne landings behind the enemy lines. The Germans say we landed 4 divisions by parachute and glider, which may be somewhat exaggerated, but there were at least 20,000. And the Prime Minister gave another example of how many chips we have in this game by announcing that the Allied Expeditionary Force is sustained by 11,000 first-line aircraft, which can be called upon as needed. This is another fact of considerable significance. It's another way of saying that the Royal Air Force is prepared to put its night bombers into the sky by daylight if the need should arise. With the RAF ready to bomb by day in an emergency, we could carry out in any threatened area a bombing offensive without equal or precedent. The British Prime Minister wound up his short resume in the House of Commons by saying that as the battle grows in size and intensity for many weeks, we will give the enemy many more surprises. The remarkably swift development of this first day is pointed up by the fact that Mr. Churchill felt it possible to make the statement he did only 2 hours after the Supreme Command here issued a cautious and vague communique.